Welcome to the show.
Glad to be with you.
I'm very happy to have you here. How are you doing today?
Pretty good.
That's good. So I guess I'd like to start right there with the title of, I guess it's now a few books ago, Hegemony or Survival. I think your point there is that if America is determined to create such a world empire, to dominate the whole world, that we'll destroy ourselves.
I think that's a fair prediction.
And that's basically what you're getting at with that title, is that right?
I'm saying that we have a choice. We can decide to live as citizens of a civilized world, in which case there's some hope for survival, or we can insist on being an outlaw state that regards itself as free from international law, international norms, moral principles, and extend power and domination, which significantly endangers the possibilities even of survival, let alone decent survival.
I'm interested in your view of this. It's a question I've asked libertarian economists on the show recently, and that is when they think the breaking point was where the maintenance of the American empire became a net loss, obviously regardless of morality, a net loss in terms of the American people at large, taxpayers financing an empire that benefits the few. Robert Higgs and David Henderson both seem to think that the American empire has never really been in the interests of the average American, but it's always been a net loss for the people at large.
Well, it depends how far you go. So the United States is the only country that was founded self-consciously as a nascent empire. I think that was George Washington's words, which is going to spread its power over the hemisphere, Thomas Jefferson. The conquest of the national territory is imperial conquest. I mean, it's not called that, but that's because of what some historians of empire call the saltwater fallacy. It's only an empire if you cross salt water.
Right.
But that doesn't make any sense. I mean, if the Mississippi happened to be, the Irish Sea, we'd call the conquest of the West imperial. In fact, even the settlement of the colonies and then their first expansion after the United States became an entity has always been imperial. It has been, and understood as such by the founding fathers. So like the conquest of Florida on totally fabricated pretext was not only taking over Spanish territory, but was destroying the indigenous population, what were called Seminoles, a mixture of lawless Indians and escaped slaves, as they put it. And so it is throughout the continent. Well, the fact is that for people like you and me, it was beneficial to exterminate the indigenous population and take over their land and resources and send the remnants off into what amount to concentration camps. The conquest of half of Mexico was obviously imperial and, again, totally unjustified, but, that brought into the Union the southwestern states in California.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Well, so what about the after the saltwater period when they decided to?
When you go to salt water, okay, the first case was Hawaii. Pretty much the same story. It wasn't beneficial to the inhabitants. In fact, by now the U.S. government has made lame apologies for having overthrown the government and taken it over. But for Barack Obama and his family, it was certainly advantageous, and other Westerners who lived there. The costs begin to mount when the United States undertook major imperialist advantage. The same is true of the Philippines. Horrible slaughter, a couple 100,000 people killed and so on, but there were advantages to a U.S. corporation, certainly, and there was a cost to the population here, but not huge. The Indochina wars turned out to be pretty costly to the domestic population here, just even disregarding the roughly 60,000 dead. On the other hand, the U.S. government basically achieved its goals in Indochina. It's not happy to say that, but it was true, and I think it was clear by about 1970. And the domestic cost was not huge, except there is a constant cost, what are called opportunity costs. The amount of the scale of the resources and the energy and the personal commitment and so on that goes into conquest and domination is taken away from a finite amount of resources and energy, which could be used for something else. Those are what economists call opportunity costs, and they're huge. When you pour money into maintaining a huge military and 750 bases around the world and so on and so forth, that's all resources, human and financial and ecological costs, which are destructive. They're taken away from beneficial uses, and they in fact destroy. Just take a look at the amount of fossil fuels used by the military forces. I mean, it's very substantial, and that is contributing substantially to possibly the end of the species. If we can't deal with this problem, our grandchildren don't have very bright prospects. So if you count the total costs, they're very substantial, always.
Well, and when you mention the moral costs and environmental costs and things like that, they're very hard to quantify just in terms of dollars, the blowback effect and that kind of thing. But it does seem at this point, though, I guess in an abstract sense, that empire's got to be a net loss, even if some arms manufacturers and oil companies and so forth are benefiting, that the American people are losing by occupying Eurasia, for example.
Well, that's a very difficult calculation. Actually, there have been some studies of the British Empire, where you have a long period. You can just trying to estimate the sort of a cost-benefit analysis of the British Empire, forgetting what it did to the victims. Let's put aside what it did to the victims, which is horrible, and ask what it did to the British themselves. Well, it's a difficult calculation. You can't get exact numbers, but the rough conclusion is that probably the costs and the benefits more or less balanced out. So then you ask, well, why have an empire? Well, the answer to that comes when you look inside Britain itself. A sector of the society gained the benefits. First the investors in the East India Company, then the manufacturers and the merchants, and later the corporations and so on. They gained the benefits. The costs were borne by the population. So, for example, the poor men who were dragooned into the British Navy, they paid the costs, and so did the families, and so did their societies, and so on. So the end conclusion, I think, is that the empire is kind of a class struggle internal to the imperial society. There are costs and benefits, but they're distributed. And the same, I think, is true of the American empire. The benefits go to multinational corporations, not just military and energy and financial institutions, and basically the dominant class internally. They make a big gains from it. The costs are paid by the general population.
What effect do you think that the current economic crisis will have? I guess some are saying that this is it. The high water mark for the American empire has been passed, and it's all rolling it back from here. George Soros, I believe, said a week or two ago that his closest comparison right now is not the Great Depression, but the breakup of the Soviet Union. Perhaps that's a bit hyperbolic, but do you think that, well, for example, Cheney's grim vision of a 100-year war on terrorism in occupying Central Asia is still on the table, or perhaps even the imperialists in the court in Washington, D.C. realize the reality that they're up against, that there's just no more money to pay for this?
I frankly don't think that's a realistic assessment. First of all, we should put aside Cheney's war on terror. For Cheney and Bush and the rest of them, combating terror was a pretty low priority. And there's very strong evidence for that. I mean, take, say, the invasion of Iraq. It was anticipated by intelligence agencies and others that invading Iraq would significantly contribute to terrorism. And in fact, it did.
Sure, so, I actually was actually just kind of being facetious with that term. I meant the long-term occupation of Central Asia, really.
Yeah. Well, all right, so let's look at so you have to ask the current financial crisis, which is very serious, and we don't know how serious it will be, is certainly hitting the United States, but it's hitting everyone else as well. I mean, its origins were largely here, but not its effects. So Europe is being hit harder than the United States. Japan is in free fall, our other major industrial competitor. China is, though it had never integrated totally with the international economy, nevertheless is suffering. In fact, about the one country, major country so far that kind of is pretty much holding out is India. But that's because it never accepted the neoliberal principles, the so-called globalization. It pretty much insulated its financial system from, international finance, not totally, but to some extent, and therefore it's still maintaining growth rates slower than before, but some. Anyhow, the costs of the financial crisis are distributed over the world, and it's very likely that the U.S. will end up, relatively speaking, one of the beneficiaries. Relatively, it'll lose, but relative to others, it may not. In fact, one indication of that is just to take a look at financial flows right now. The investors around the world who want secure investments are sending them mostly to the U.S. Treasury, even though they're getting virtually no interest or maybe none, because that reflects an expectation that the U.S. will remain the dominant power. And I think that's not unrealistic. I mean, in terms of, the U.S. has enormous advantages over other economies. I mean, take, say, Europe. I mean, the European Union, its economy is kind of on a par with the United States, maybe a little greater. But just consider the advantages that the U.S. has. I mean, if decisions are made in Washington, suppose wise decisions are made about how to stimulate the economy, overcome the financial crisis and so on. I mean, a separate question is whether they are wise decisions, but put that aside. Suppose decisions are made, well, they apply to the whole country, okay, because it's a unified country. On the other hand, you can't make decisions like that in Europe. There is no central authority that can reach such decisions. So you have national-based conflicts. The French want to do it one way, the Germans want to do it a different way, they can't cooperate, and so on. And that significantly undercuts the possibility of a coordinated response to the crises. You can read about this right now in the business press. In fact, the European Commission just put out a study a couple of days ago describing the significant harm that's being caused to European recovery just by the disunity and the internal conflicts of the European Union. I mean, Japan doesn't have that, but Japan Japan has almost no internal resources and relies crucially on export markets. The U.S. doesn't. It has a huge internal market. It has enormous internal resources and so on. Mm-hmm. And so it goes case by case. I mean, people talk about China, but there's a lot of it in India, but there's a good deal of illusion there. I mean, they have, China in particular has undergone a very significant growth, but that growth is pretty artificial. I mean, it's based on the existence of export markets, primarily, but not only the United States, which is fragile. And a good deal of the production in China is foreign-owned. As you move towards the more advanced high-tech end, even more of it is. And China has incredible internal problems that the West doesn't have. environmental problems, the problem of hundreds of millions of people who are, barely surviving. I mean, there are some who predict peasant revolutions in China. And you get a sense of this just by looking at the position of India and China in the what's called the Human Development Index of the United Nations, which measures various factors. Last time I looked, China was somewhere in the 80s, maybe 88th or something, and India was about 128th. Well, that reflects huge internal problems that they may or may not be able to overcome.
Well, it seems like most of the people who talk about the rising strength of China are allied with the war party on the right here in America, who want to pretend that there's a dragon out there that we need to be protected from.
That's true, but they're not the only ones. There's a lot of illusions about China, just as there were about Japan. It wasn't that many years ago when there were books coming out, about how Japan is number one and they're going to take over the American economy and so on and so forth. You have to be really careful about analyzing these ideas. And of course, in military power, I mean, the U.S. It's comparable to the rest of the world combined. No other country has anything like our military in scale or technological advance, and no other country has 750 military bases around the world from which we can intervene anytime we want. Mm-hmm. But my guess is, this is all speculation because nobody knows how deep this crisis is going to go. But I think there's a fair chance that the U.S. will emerge pretty much where it was, relatively speaking. That is, as the dominant power in a world system that has declined economically. Mm-hmm. And it depends a lot on how the crisis is handled internally here.
Right. In terms of absolutes, do you think that, rather than relative power, I mean, in terms of boots on the ground in Central Asia, do you think that the long war, as it apparently has been concocted in the minds at the Pentagon, of eventually having bases and occupation forces in all the stands and building up that American military presence in the kind of triangle between Russia and China there, do you think that is still, a permanent fixture of American policy? And in fact, I guess, do you even think that it's really about Russia and China, as I'm implying in my question there?
Yeah. Well, there certainly is a bipartisan consensus saying yes. After all, Obama's main foreign policy departure from the Bush administration is to increase the scale of intervention. For one thing, his military budget calls for an increase in intervention forces, Marines, Special Forces, and so on. And he's planning to put 17,000 more troops into Afghanistan. It's partly Russia and China. This is what was called the Great Game in the 19th century, which was also focused on Afghanistan. At that time, it was mainly Britain and Russia who's going to gain control. And now there are other players. But there is a China-based Asian system developing, even has institutions like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is aimed at creating a major sphere, including of influence, intervention, protection of resources, and so on. It includes all the Central Asian states. It includes Russia, which has enormous resources of its own. India, again, potentially significant power, though not on the scale of the West, is an observer. Iran is an observer. That gives them, first of all, natural gas, huge natural gas and other fossil fuel resources, but also an opening to the major energy resources of the world in the Gulf states, which are already exporting a good deal of their energy. I don't know the exact figures, maybe even a majority, expanding it to the east. And, of course, China, which is not intimidated by the United States, continues to invest in Iran and is also, it's not competing with the United States and Saudi Arabia, but it's moving in that direction. And Afghanistan happens to be right in the middle of all of this, a highly strategic position, and domination of Afghanistan, and that means Pakistan, because they're closely integrated, is a central part of the new version of the great game, just as it was of the old great game in the 19th century. In fact, a lot of the conflict right now has to do with the arbitrary actions of the British Empire, which split the Pashtun areas of Afghanistan and Pakistan into two separate parts. Pakistan was then India, British-run India, and they created a line called the Durand Line, which breaks up that region pretty much in half. The population never accepted it. The Pashtuns are a dominant group in Afghanistan and substantial in Pakistan. They never accepted this, and the Afghan state itself has repeatedly called for abolishing the Durand Line and creating a more natural division that won't break societies, tribal societies, into two parts. Now, the fighting right now on the Afghan-Pakistan border on both sides is called, by the United States and the West, it's called aggression, or intervention from Pakistan. But that's not the way the people who live there look at it. I mean, they don't accept our imperial assumptions that an arbitrary line established by Britain in order to protect its own interests is necessarily what they should abide by.
Mm-hmm. Well, and of course, their further resistance is just the further excuse for further intervention, and on it goes like that. Let me ask you about the oil pipeline part of the great game there. If I remember correctly, comments you made back in the 1990s, you talked about how the sanctions on Iraq, that part of that was keeping Iraqi oil off the market to keep the price artificially high. And I wonder whether you think that is still a major part of component about America's policy in these countries in regards to oil. I know that Greg Palast in his book Armed Madhouse makes the case. It's all about keeping Iraqi and I guess probably Iranian oil off the market to keep the prices high. Do you think that follows? Whether that's do you agree with that about Iraq, and do you think that's the same kind of game going on in Central Asia? If so,
just for clarity, I didn't actually say that in the 1990s. I mean, there are people who do, and I think you can make a case, but it wasn't my view, and actually, it's not my view now. I think the U.S. would be very happy to get Iraqi and Iranian oil on the market if it's Western controlled. Okay, in fact, it's very striking what happened in Iraq. The United States suffered a real defeat in Iraq. Step by step, it's been compelled to abandon its war aims. If you go back to, say, November 2007, and you take a look at Bush's declarations about the war aims, which were explicit, they included maintaining a massive military presence, including the military bases, no timeline for withdrawal, and special privileges given to U.S. and other Western corporations in accessing the energy resources of Iraq. Well, that was as late as a year and a half ago. But by then, the U.S. had already been compelled to back down on many of its goals. It's kind of suppressed here. But if you look back, the U.S. was strongly opposed to any form of democracy in Iraq. It tried very hard to prevent elections. It was forced to accept them because it couldn't deal with hundreds of thousands of people in the streets, then called out by the Ayatollah al-Sistani. So it accepted elections reluctantly, tried to subvert them, imposed what they thought would be their own prime minister, namely Maliki, but that they couldn't control him. And up till the recent signing of the Status Forces Agreement, you read the American press, they were saying, well, Maliki just has to pretend to be in favor of a termination of occupation because he's playing to popular opinion. It's tacitly conceded here that attending to popular opinion is wrong. That's part of the deep-seated fear and hatred of democracy among U.S. and other Western elites. But it turned out he wasn't pandering to public opinion. He was, in fact, but he was also pushing for the same course for good or bad reasons. Anyway, the end result is that if the United States lives up to the agreement that it signed, SOFA, it will have abandoned most of its war aims. The military bases will be gone. They'll be turned over to Iraqis. There is no special privilege to Western corporations. I mean, they're going to try hard to achieve it, but they'll have to somehow try to subvert the agreements they've signed, and so on. It is a major victory for Iraqis. And it's instructive to notice that it's a victory for nonviolent resistance. The U.S. could kill insurgents. That's no problem. But it couldn't deal with mass public nonviolent resistance. Now, this is understood by the correspondents and other analysts who know Iraq best. So you can read this in, the writings of Patrick Cockburn and Jonathan Steele and others. It's not a common view in the anti-war movement here, but I think they're mistaken. That is, I think Cockburn and Steele and others are correct. It was a major victory, and the task of the anti-war movement here is to make that victory stick and expand it.
You're referring explicitly to Ayatollah Sistani's calling the people out into the streets twice back in
the early stages, yeah.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
But in the more recent years, it's just huge popular support, and Western polls show it. The Western Pentagon polls, other Western-run polls show that the Iraqi population wanted the Americans out. They thought the famous surge, harmed, increased violence. They didn't want the American troops there, and they want the country for themselves. Well, the U.S. and they've also opposed, they haven't even been able to pass the U.S.-initiated oil bill, which in its original form would have indeed privileged Western U.S. corporations, as Bush announced straight out. I think it was November 2007 or so. So yes, it's continuing, and there's a lot of a lot of internal issues I'm not talking about. It's much more complex than this, but I think that's a kind of a major thread. So the Iraq War did not turn out at all the way Cheney and others wanted it. And of course it's destroyed Iraq. Meanwhile, the country may never recover. But this is just, again, thinking about it from the point of view of the imperial power. As far as Iran is concerned, it's a kind of an interesting case, because here is a case where it's rather like Cuba. The American population, by a large majority, wants to put an end to threats against Iran and to enter into normal relations, just as in the case of Cuba for decades. American corporations pretty much agree. So the energy corporations would be delighted to get back into Iran. It's got a ton of resources. They'd rather exploit them than have China do it. And it's a huge market for American exports, potentially. Cuba is much smaller, but the same situation. Agribusiness, energy, pharmaceuticals would prefer to have normal relations with Cuba. But in both of these cases, there's a kind of a state interest that is overwhelming popular concern, which is normal. Public rarely has any role in policy making, but is also overcoming business interests, which is unusual. And the state interest in this case, I think, is primarily punishment for disobedience. In the case of Cuba, we have the documents, so it's clear. The Kennedy and Johnson administrations were deeply concerned about what they called Cuba's successful defiance of U.S. policies going back to the Monroe Doctrine. And Kennedy, in particular, and his advisors were concerned that a successful Cuba might be a model that others in the region with similar problems might want to follow, and that had to be nipped in the bud. And it continues. You simply have to punish the people of Cuba for their successful defiance. It's kind of a mafia principle. The Godfather doesn't tolerate disobedience, too dangerous. And I think much the same is true in Iran.
In fact, in the 1990s, didn't Dick Cheney even travel to the Middle East, which is the ultimate no-no, right, to leave your country and talk bad about it while you're gone? And he denounced Bill Clinton and the sanctions on Iran and said, these are people we can do business with.
The sanctions on Iran were really not discussed much. The business world didn't like them, and the population was opposed, but there wasn't much popular opposition to them. In fact, I don't think many people even knew about them. But it is state policy. Has been consistent state policy. Yes, of course, there's dissension, and there are people who reflect the concerns of the business world, who would indeed like to invest in Iran. And in fact, Cheney himself and Halliburton were finding ways to use Iranian and, in fact, Iraqi oil and make profit from it. But there has been a fairly consistent state interest in punishing Iranians and Cubans, and it's primarily for their disobedience. I mean, the United States, we talk about the terrible things Iran is doing to us, but it's the other way around. I mean, the United States has been torturing Iranians since 1953, when U.S.-British military coup overthrew their parliamentary government, installed a tyrant who we strongly backed up until he was overthrown in 1979, and then we immediately supported Saddam Hussein in his war against Iran, which was a murderous war. I mean, chemical weapons. He killed hundreds of thousands of Iranians. And then as soon as that war was over, Iraq won pretty much, largely because of direct U.S. intervention in the Gulf. As soon as it was over, we imposed sanctions on them, punishing them again. And so it goes up till today. Now, there hasn't been a moment since 1953 when we haven't been, in one way or another, seriously punishing the people of Iran. And since 1979, I suspect, we don't have internal documents here as we do in Cuba, but I suspect it's pretty much the same kind of thinking. We cannot accept successful defiance. You can't run the world that way. Going back to pipelines, there is an Afghan connection there. I myself don't think it's a dominant feature, though others disagree. But there has long been talk about a pipeline through Afghanistan. In fact, the Clinton administration and U.S. business was working on it in the 90s. That would be from Central Asia. And right now there is on the planning board a pipeline it's called the Tapi pipeline from Turkmenistan, huge sources of gas, through Afghanistan into Pakistan and finally India. India's energy's poor. The idea would be to we're trying hard to bring India into the U.S. orbit, and one way of doing it would be to give them a source of energy separate from Iran, crucially, because this pipeline would not pass through Iran. Now, there's a much simpler way for India to get energy, and that's a pipeline directly from Iran to India. But the U.S. is strongly opposed to that because we have to isolate Iran and bring India into our system of control in some other way. So these struggles are going on constantly. Mm-hmm. The pipeline through Afghanistan would go right through Kandahar, one of the most troubled provinces there. That's where the Canadians are. These things are always in the background. We can.
Well, I think that was even part of the nuclear deal with India, wasn't it? That the pipeline would go this way instead of that.
Yeah, I think you're right. The India deal, which is very serious, it seriously undermined the Non-Proliferation Treaty. That's something that has large consequences. Partly it was simply motivated by, as was stated openly, in fact, by opening the Indian commercial market to U.S. manufacturers, of course, nuclear energy manufacturers, but also military industry and others. But I suspect you're right. It was partly a way to help India overcome at least part of its energy problem without moving towards the natural relationship with Iran. Mm-hmm. Now, India is kind of is ambivalent. They do not. I mean, they have joined with the United States in a certain alliance, but they're leaving their options open, both with China and with Iran.
I've been reading up on some of your articles that you wrote about the recent Gaza war and Obama's position on the Israel-Palestine issue so far and that kind of thing. I think if I could try to get you to address my main question, it would be, why does the policy of Israel seem to be perpetual, dare I say, low-level warfare and occupation against the people of Palestine, if they don't mean to let them have a two-state solution and sovereignty over Gaza and the West Bank, why don't they just do, a push and move them all from Gaza into Egypt, from the West Bank into Jordan, and be done with it? Why is the policy to leave things like this indefinitely, apparently?
Well, it's not indefinitely. They are, there's been a policy of settlement that's over a century now. And it's pretty much the same before the state and after the state. The idea is to slowly, what's called establish facts, go a little bit further. Take an acre here, an acre there, build an outpost here, and then expand it later. And keep doing it as much as you can without the outside world stepping in to stop it. Now, if you do something like what you described, there'd be, the United States and Europe could no longer pretend not to notice. There would be such enormous outrage in the Muslim world and elsewhere that the U.S. and its European clients, which is what they are, would move in to stop it. Now, Israel doesn't want that. They want the U.S. to keep supporting it and to pretend not to notice it. So American taxpayers are funding all of this, most of it, but we're not supposed to notice it. So you do it slowly, step by step. So, for example, if you read this morning's newspaper, New York Times, you'll see a small comment at the end of a column referring to a recent study by Peace Now, which has been the main monitor of settlements, pointing out that current plans are to double the Jewish population in the West Bank. Now, that's all criminal. I mean, nobody doubts that even the Israelis that that's in violation of international law. But they think if they do it slowly, maybe the U.S. will pretend not to notice and will continue funding it and giving it military and diplomatic support. But the option that you described would just be untenable. And they know it, so you do it step by step. In fact, there's even a phrase, a dunam, which is kind of like, area of land, part of an acre, dunam after dunam, goat after goat, and so on, but so that the outside world doesn't really notice.
Well, what solution do you think people should push for? I mean, it almost seems like pushing for a Palestinian state at this point is just playing the game and a losing one.
I don't agree with. A lot of people think that, including a lot of my friends, but I don't agree. There is an international consensus. It's very broad. It includes essentially everyone, even in Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, and obviously Europe and the non-aligned countries. And it's for a settlement on a two-state settlement on the internationally recognized border with maybe minor and mutual modifications. Now, that's been on the board for over 30 years, and the United States has consistently blocked it. It's unilateral blocking by the United States. But there is an important exception, one exception. In January of 2001, Clinton's last month, there was a negotiation session at Taba in Egypt between the highest level Israeli and Palestinian negotiators, and they came very close to a settlement. In fact, at their last news conference, they said if they'd had a little more time, they could have reached a settlement. Well, Israel called it off, and the U.S. let them do it. But a lot has happened since January 2001, but not enough to make this impossible. If the U.S. decided to agree with the rest of the world, we're back to the first question about being an outlaw state. If the U.S. agreed to go along with the rest of the world, Israel would inevitably go along. They have no choice. And there would be it's claimed that there would be a civil war in Israel if they did this, but that's not true. If Israel just announced that the Israeli army is pulling back to Israel, almost all the settlers would leave. They'd be subsidized to leave, in fact, with no violence and conflict. It's completely feasible, and much of it turns on U.S. policy. Now, the U.S. population is in favor of this, a large majority. But as usual, popular opinion does not influence policy unless it becomes organized and active. So I think the real answer to the question is in the hands of people like you and me. Can we organize public opinion, which is already there, to be active enough so as to pressure the U.S. government to join the world on this issue instead of defying it? And that's the main stumbling block. And that doesn't seem to me insuperable. Greater challenges than that have been met.
Thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Bye.
Everyone, that's Professor Noam Chomsky, linguist from MIT, author of a ton of great books, including What Uncle Sam Really Wants, Manufacturing Consent with Edward S. Herman, Hegemony or Survival, and the latest one is Failed States, the Abuse of Power and Assault on Democracy. This is Antiwar Radio, and we'll be right back.